Hello, and welcome to our webcast. I'm Amy Pendergrass with Moss Adams, and I'm going to get us started for today's session, Drive Good Governance for a Highly Successful Not-for-Profit. Before we begin, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, and now I would like to introduce today's presenters. We have Colleen Rozillis and Melissa Harman, both partners here at Moss Adams. Their bios and contact information are located in your webcast console for your convenience. And now I would like to turn the floor over to Colleen to get the presentation started. Colleen?
Great, thank you so much, Amy, and welcome everyone. We're so glad you could join us today. So today we're going to talk a little bit about governance structures, policies, and processes, but really practices. What makes a good board? How can we operate more effectively to have more effective governance, but also really set the tone for the organization and provide that important leadership? We'll also talk about how committees are best structured and how we can best use committees. We're going to dive into finance, investment, and audit since we are an accounting firm, so we have some experience there. We'll talk about what's happening in governance right now and what emerging trends are occurring. And then we'll give a couple of tips for effective meetings. Throughout this presentation, as we go through, we hope to have time for questions at the end. Please submit questions as we're going. If we don't get to your question today, we will respond individually after the presentation. So with that, Amy, I believe we have our first poll.
Great, yes, so our first polling question is, what is your role in your not-for-profit? A, board member, B, committee member, C, CEO or executive director, D, management, E, staff, F, other or not applicable. And we will give you a few moments to respond. To respond, you will need to click the button next to the answer you choose and hit submit. And if you can't see the submit button, just enlarge your slide area. And I do see some people responding via the Q&A window. If you want CPE, you will need to respond on the slide itself so it can track that for you. All right, here are the results.
All right, thank you, Amy. So we have a pretty good spread. We have a lot of folks in nonprofit management here, so that's great. We're going to talk about the board staff partnership, and we'd love your questions as we're going through just thinking about what your role is and how to better interact with the board. So thank you all for answering this. So first up, we're just going to talk about what governance is and what actually good governance means, because there's often a really different interpretation depending on what your role is, what organizations you've been involved in, and you know, what baggage everybody brings, right, to every single role that they come onto. When we lead governance workshops and workshops with boards, we often ask this kind of a basic question at the beginning: why does this organization exist, and why does the board exist? And a lot of times we're met with blank stares. That's not something that folks have ever really thought about. We sign up for board service, we engage in not-for-profit work from a values-based perspective, but don't ever take that step back and think about what really is our role here. So we thought, let's really just start with those basics. Governance is policies, it's systems, it's the behaviors that oversee an organization's strategy and outcomes. And when we think about the governing body overseeing what leadership does, we really want to make sure that leadership is moving the mission forward and doing that in an effective way, and that there is accountability associated with that. There are quite a few governance models out there that organizations can use. We most often see the top two on this slide, the structural and the policy models. Structural models, I would say, are kind of the traditional board model, whereas policy governance really came into light in the 90s and has been big in especially school boards. A lot of larger organizations find policy governance to be very effective. But we are also seeing organizations really reassess which models they're using to meet their business needs, because they find that that traditional way of governing is not necessarily doing a good job really connecting to the community, understanding how we can hold folks accountable to the outcomes that we set in our strategic plan. And so we're seeing a rise in terms of that outcomes-based model right now with a lot of the organizations that we work with. The consensus model is also something that is relatively popular in smaller not-for-profits. But one of the challenges with the consensus model is that an individual can hold up decision-making, and decision-making can become very slow because we want to get toward consensus. A lot of nonprofits often work informally, wanting to get consensus on all votes anyway, but when we use that as our specific model, we have to make sure that folks really understand the importance of collaboration and give and take. And then there's the competency model. That model is relatively new, and it really is focused on who we have on the board and doesn't necessarily set up the structures for policies or strategy or accountability. And what this really says is every single governance model has its pros and cons, and there are opportunities for improvement in each of them. And in each case, the board has to do the work to really establish those expectations to achieve the results that the board wants to see. In any governing model, board members have these 4 key responsibilities. You know, we really want the board to be involved in establishing the strategic plan, that mission, vision, values, and goals. We want it to set the direction for the organization. We want to know how we're performing against our stated goals and what that looks like and how we will measure that. And then there's providing goodwill and support for the organization. And that's something that folks can sometimes forget. It can be more of a tension with elected boards or appointed officials where you might not have as much control over who is on the board, or in a place like a school board, for example, where folks might get initially engaged because of advocacy or activism, whereas a leadership role really does require that goodwill and support. And so we sometimes are brought in because there is that tension between balancing accountability with goodwill and support. So it's always good to remind yourself of what these particular roles are and really focus on the fact that we are all part of the same organization. A common challenge we also see in boards is engagement in the wrong place. We either have folks very disengaged or focus on extraordinarily long-term goals and outcomes, or we have folks really in the weeds in day-to-day operations and kind of getting in the middle and acting as if they sort of wish they were staff. And we want boards very much focused in that sweet spot of policy and strategy. Another way to think about the board's sweet spot is through the lens of your strategic plan. So the board guides that mission, vision, and values and is involved in collaboration with staff, what our goals are. But staff really leads those strategies, tactics, and outcome reporting. So when we think about this on the left-hand side of the slide, the board really decides that what, and then the executive and staff are empowered to do the how. And that means implementation, it means formulating the budget, it means providing recommendations and implementing policy, whereas the board is really on that sort of approval and monitoring side. It's also a good reminder that in most organizations, the board has just the one employee in the CEO or executive director, and really should be working through that one employee and holding them accountable versus working directly with staff unless asked. And sometimes that can be a little bit challenging, especially in smaller organizations or in organizations where we have working boards. Melissa, do you have any thoughts on this division of responsibilities and where you've seen that work or not?
I think this is a reevaluation over time. And sometimes even when it is working really effectively, it sometimes isn't. I would say what I have been seeing more and more are sort of some rules of engagement that a board chair or a committee chair will bring into each and every meeting. They will go through a bit of a reminder of the charter, which I'm going to speak to here in a minute when I talk about good governance and committees, but they'll have in their charter what are the rules of engagement. And what that means is if I'm a board member or a committee member, here's the expectation of me as a board member. And so it really is set up to provide or eliminate scope creep, because I think the smaller the organization, at least from my own experience, that can creep. And there is governance that is needed, sometimes even in management for internal control support, those sort of things. And so the best practices I've seen are to really embed that in your charter, have it as a standing part of the agenda. What are the rules of engagement? What is considered governance? What is considered management? Some of the do's and don'ts. I've also seen in some of that too, just the good behaviors, right, that we would expect of a board. Let people speak, make sure you're listening, what words we shouldn't say that would be degrading to others, those sort of things. So I think I'm seeing a movement towards that to try and really get in front of this so we're not having to fix this on the back end because it has not been remediated, and now we're having an issue where we've got effectively board members acting as management. So that's a little bit of what I've seen in a best practice.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that practical application. And now over to you.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm going to do a little bit of a dive into board policies. And so, coming off of that, create, review, and implement those policies. Let's talk a little bit about board policies. And so when we're thinking about what should, and I know when I'm onboarding at a board, one of the things that I want to know is what do we have in writing? What do we have in charters? What do we have in policy? Board and organizational policies, what is written. More so if I'm taking on fiduciary responsibility for a board, I want to know where those gaps might exist. And if I'm in management, I want to know how I can support the board and where they may not exist. And so on the left-hand side are written policy musts. So these are policies that we and the Council on Not-for-Profits and the IRS, these are questions straight out of a 990, the tax return for not-for-profit organizations, ask whether or not you have. So these are important. They are seen by stakeholders as important, and they are seen as something that really, to uphold the organization, are necessary to be in writing. So a conflict of interest for so many reasons, whether it's at the board level, and there are board components of that for related parties and other items, as well as in the organization. What I will say about a conflict of interest policy and the importance of that is that it is adhered to, and there is compliance and conflict of interest statements from the entire board received on an annual basis. That is critical. You can have a written policy, but if you are not monitoring that written policy, you are not effectively adopting that policy. So I think that's something just of mind to keep. And then the gift acceptance is really important. What are you going to receive? What risk will you tolerate as an organization? Where are the risks that we have? What do we not want to accept? What could we accept? Are we going to accept crypto? Are we going to accept private investments? Are we going to accept property? What are you willing as an organization to accept in terms of risk in that joint venture? What are you doing? How are you monitoring that? And especially the parties that you are in the venture with. A whistleblower, it is one of the things as an auditor I always look at. It is something we pull information on when we do an audit. It is absolutely critical, and it is a huge deterrent if you look at the Certified Fraud Examiner's report on an annual basis, most fraud is identified through a whistleblower. It is one of the best controls you can have as an organization as it relates to fraud. So it is incumbent that you have it in writing, and that you advertise it. And then document retention and destruction. It is key, especially if you have regulatory agencies that are coming in or may have questions, or just the organization. What you don't want documents from 15 years ago that should have been destructed to put you at risk, those sort of things, and just being really conscientious about that. So those are must-haves. There are a lot of regulatory agencies that require those. You really need those. On the right-hand side, written policy, good to have. These are those policies that we really do, as financial stewards, want to have written down. What are we going to invest in? How often are we reviewing that? Who can approve that? Treasury, who can open bank accounts, right? Who can be a signer? Same with procurement and embedded in that. If you are lucky enough to have operating reserves, what is your policy? What are you stashing away? When can you release any of those reserves, and for what? So that it really is established. There's some others on here, financial close, and that's timing. Cybersecurity assessments. What are you doing for the risk? How are you remediating some of the risks? IT, I could probably do an entire session on protocols associated with that. So how are we using the organization's software, hardware, and the internet and the web? What is allowed? What is not allowed? When do we have to change passwords? How do we document change management? Those sort of things. Crypto, big. I'm a huge believer that you need policy. It doesn't need to be its own standalone policy. It can be embedded in other policies, but are you even going to tolerate it? Will you procure in crypto or other digital assets? Will you accept cryptocurrency? Will you hold it? Those are sort of things. Employment policies, and I have a slide on the next one that goes through a lot of these as more of an inventory. I'm not going to cover that again. That's a whole session, but there are so many things legally you have to have in writing. And then property and equipment, what are you doing of it? When do you dispose of it? How do you dispose of it? Do you have to get competitive bids? Those sort of things on property and equipment really need to be in writing. And I think for not just for the sake of writing, and I can just tell you from my own experience, whether I sat in the board position or whether I sat in a committee position, or whether I've sat in, obviously, my management position at the firm, or an auditor, these are things that will wreck basically the progression of an organization if you don't have some of these established. You will go down rabbit holes. There will be meetings about this. There will be what ifs, and it will take so much time. My recommendation is get in front of these, get everybody on the same page, get them documented, and definitely get them in writing. And one of the other recommendations, and I know we'll probably touch on this, is how often you review it. There's a lot of times I'll pick up a gift acceptance policy when I'm auditing a client, and it hasn't been updated in 20 years. And I think really having a cadence that's part of your infrastructure where you do review your inventory of written policies, and they are reapproved or updated on a regular basis. And regular could mean annual, it could mean biannual, but that is something I think we have to be very purposeful in what we're doing and really incorporate that. So just something to keep in mind on that. I think moving on from that piece of it is thinking about the organizational policies. And that was board. And there's some of the board that obviously crosses over into organizational, and they're both, right? So it affects the board because of their fiduciary responsibility, but it also impacts the management side of it. I'm going to focus on, for this discussion, just the board-related policies and the financial policies, so the left and right. Like I said, the personnel, this could be an entire probably 3-hour session on best practices for personnel policies, but these are the policies that Board Source recommends that are in writing and that you do retain. I've covered some of the board-related policies. I'll hone in on, I think, the very first one under board, talking about terms and eligibility and what you would do or what would cause somebody to be removed from the board, and what is that process to remove somebody from the board, that sort of thing. How do you elect? How do you nominate? Those logistical items that sometimes are incredibly ambiguous. And especially if you have term limits and you have this rotation of board members, sometimes get lost. And sometimes it's the administrative assistant or the executive assistant to the board of the liaison that knows that information. And if it's not in writing, it gets lost. And it's really critical to have that. Code of conduct, a lot of states actually require this. A lot of states actually require it to be on the very front page of your website. So that's critical. What I will say about that is that it should be reviewed on a regular basis. There's so much changing in the world, and just making sure that you're not, for your conflict of interest and your code of conduct, it can't be stale. So you need to be revisiting that. There should be somebody who's taking responsibility. And ultimately, it is the board's responsibility to understand that, authorize, and review that. I'm going to bucket confidentiality, indemnification, nepotism, and basically media relations all in one. And I'll call this the behaviors of the board, right? Do you have policy surrounding the behaviors of the board, what they can and can't say, who they can and can't say to, who they can and can't bring to a meeting or bring into the organization? I think this is so incredibly important. If you don't have these rules or policies surrounding it, there can be so much either factual or perceived that could really damage the reputation of an organization. So being very purposeful and thoughtful around that are absolutely critical. I think the reimbursement, I'm just going to hit on the travel expenses, and this could be anything. We don't address this much, and especially in the world that we're doing a lot of board meetings on video, it's not something that we think too much about, but it could be as we're reopening, as we're going into this, and especially if you're doing regular retreats. Who's reimbursing that? What would we pay for? What wouldn't? What type of travel? I had a board that I sat on where everybody wanted to travel first class, right? And is that acceptable? And I think really setting those limits. But I also think the other thing is, as we're trying to engage, and we'll talk a little bit in a bit about community involvement and getting others involved when we're thinking about a cross-sectionality in a board. Sometimes, do we want to sponsor travel for somebody that we really want to be part of this board? And what would those limits be? Really, what is the expectation? And I'll get to kind of measuring an effective committee, but what's the expectation of the board? When are you going to attend? How much should you attend? What is not acceptable? How much are you going to give? Those sort of things. I'm going to pause a little bit on diversity. We have a couple slides on this where we're really going to talk about that cross-sectionality of boards and who should be there, that piece of it. But those are the organizational policies that we really need to be thinking about. I'm going to touch just very briefly on financial policies, because I do have these embedded in committee expectations and responsibilities in some upcoming slides. But these are really, it's a good list of what you should be thinking about in terms of written policies for the organization. These are just some of those. I've already highlighted them that are really important that you need to be, really focused on that, obviously investment policy and those sort of things. But the other thing that's on here is your endowment policy. I don't know how many times I will ask an organization what their endowment policy is, and they will say, well, it's whatever the investment firm is doing, or we just kind of follow up MIFA, or it's just not documented. And so I think having documentation around endowment policy, what would we do with the board endowment? What are we doing with the donor endowment? What are we spending and how are we reviewing that? What are the rules of the state dictate on this? Are we going to spend if it's underwater? And having policy around that just really to protect the organization. And with that, we have the next polling slide. So how comprehensive are your policies and procedures? They are amazing and up to date. We've got some gaps, or we need a full update.
And while everyone's responding, I do want to just remind you that if you would like to receive CPE for today's webcast, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions that we pull up. All right, we'll give it a few more seconds. Here you go.
Excellent. I would expect the largest line to be the green line. I guess if we would have asked the question, and have they been updated in the last year, this may be a different outcome. Perfect. With that, I'm going to pass it back over to Colleen to go through habits of best boards.
Thank you, Melissa. So, we can have all the policies and structures, bylaws, and frameworks in place for good governance, but we really need to practice good governance. We're going to get into behavior a little deeper. Even strong boards can improve their culture, their operating policies, and their cultural norms and values. So first up, I wanted to talk just a little bit about how the board sets the tone for the organization. I'm going to talk about a few of these in depth in a couple of slides going forward, but I wanted to highlight just a few. Melissa had mentioned that we often see policies when we come into an organization that were drafted once and haven't been updated, never reviewed. There are some of those policies that are really critical to review on an annual basis, things like reserves and investments, things like anti-discrimination, but all policies really need to be reviewed on a systematic basis. And you can actually write it into the policy, the intention for what a regular review looks like. If that's every year, if it's every 3 years, I would say the maximum is every 5 years, because we really want to make sure that we're looking at policies and making sure that they really line up with, actually, are they helping us to achieve what we want the organization to achieve? So it's not just what does the language say, but what are the outcomes of each of these policies that we adopt? It's really easy, especially as the nature of boards, as they turn over, to not realize things that we have put in place and what that potential impact could be over time. Another thing that I wanted to point out was really thinking about this concept of shared constituency. So an organization is never just the board and staff. It really is around who do we serve, what are their needs, and taking that constant connection back to the community. As board members, we want to make sure that those of us who serve on boards are connected to our mission, understanding who we serve, what the programs are, and really providing that representation, as well as doing a regular assessment of ourselves and our own performance, our level of representation, perception of the impact our organization is making in the community, and being willing to change our strategy, to change our behaviors, and potentially even our programs based on that self-assessment. There are a couple of other points that I think are really important to prioritize here. One is to regularly evaluate the board's performance. The best boards do an annual self-assessment. It's very easy to do. Just, you can do a quick anonymous survey. You can have the governance committee lead an in-depth assessment. I've been on boards where we've had the governance committee interview each board member at the end of the year just to ask, how is it going and how are we doing, and get that individual engagement, plus have everyone think about the group. It really just depends on how much time and effort you want to put into it, but it's very simple to even just do a 5-question self-assessment at the end of every governance year and see, how are we doing and could we be better? And that can often surface really great opportunities to re-engage with staff, to re-engage with communities, as well as to identify, are there folks who are not as engaged as they could be, and can we either help to close that gap, or is it time to potentially roll those folks off the board? The last thing I want to touch on is this last bullet on the slide around practicing continuous personal learning and development. In a leadership role, as I mentioned, boards really do set the tone. And so you come onto a board because of your expertise. You also need to come onto a board with humility and a learning mindset. We're not necessarily the experts in everything that the organization does. We want to be open to what other board members have to say. And as the organization evolves, we should be open to evolving too. That means that we have to be invested in board education, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. We also want to make sure that we are invested in being flexible, and when things do change, being supportive of that change and not being stuck in how things have been done in the past. It's important to acknowledge also that boards are assembled from individuals. Each of us comes with our own unique perspective and experience from our lives, our day jobs, other board service. I think this is particularly important when we have boards where we might not have term limits. Family foundations, for example, some private foundations where we've got folks who've served together for a long time, but we might bring on a new member for a fresh perspective or to expand the board slightly. It's important to think about what our norms and values are and make sure that we are creating that inclusive environment, in particular, again, because we are setting the tone. So how would we want staff to act? How would we imagine staff meetings to go? We want meetings to be also, based on that concept of inclusion and mutual respect. I think it's very important to have clear communication for every piece of information that we have from board to staff and outward. So what are our clear expectations, making sure that we're direct. If we do not have explicit understandings of what those expectations are for each board member, Melissa mentioned this when she was talking a little bit about policies, right? We can create confusion, we can create resentment when expectations are mismatched. We just want to be very clear about what we expect from folks and in our behaviors as well. And that can really create, while it might be a little bit difficult to actually sit down and talk about what are our norms and what's important for us, it can create a much more effective board going forward if we just get that all on paper. And the last and most important piece of this is to self-reflect, to take that annual self-assessment, to really think what are ways that we can operate better as a group because we are providing leadership. The other thing that I think is really important when we are practicing good governance habits as a board is thinking about how we make decisions. This absolutely does take practice because many boards, folks cycle on and off and are changing. It's important to embed this in your governance practices and really to help increase that decision-making capacity. So we need to understand, for example, the communication styles of each board member, what information board members need to actually make effective decisions. Do they feel equipped on a day-to-day basis to make decisions? To understand really who we are and how we identify ourselves as a group, again, linking back to your mission, vision, and values. Understanding everyone's individual conflict style. If there is a difficult decision that has to be made, do we know folks that need to process one-on-one? Do we have folks who really like to talk things out versus folks who need to take a step back and process things and then come back to the table? Making sure that we understand those things about each other so that we can make better decisions. Understanding and communicating clearly about individual concerns. And then really understanding how each member operates, what their influence is, what their role is on the board, and how they might exercise that through time. And this is absolutely a piece of work for the governance committee and for the executive committee to very much understand these things so that we can equip folks to make the best decisions. Some decisions are really easy. I think we've all been through a period over the last several years where we've had to make some really tough decisions for our organizations. And so the more that we build this muscle, the easier it will be for us to tackle really challenging things. So I'm going to hand it over to Melissa to dig in more about the board staff partnership.
Perfect, thanks. So really relating to this and honestly the relationship between the board and the staff, there's some things to keep in mind. There should, and I'm going to cover this on a little bit about supporting. The role of the board is really to support the staff and to support management. Keep that communication channel open, frequent and strategic, and through some of that just ongoing communication, feedback, and performance reviews. And specifically, when I think about the staff relationship, I really think about the CEO or executive director or president of an organization, and just thinking about that relationship. And we'll dive into in kind of that piece of it on the next slide. But I wanted to step back and say and remind you, and I won't dig in too much into this because it's a lot of information, but it is the responsibility of the board to really be responsible for the search of a president, of an executive director, CEO. It is their responsibility. And here are some best practices that we've seen. Every organization I've been on has gone through this search. We've created a committee that is cross-sectional, not just board members, but also part of management and part of the community, having a team that gets together for that evaluation. And the starting point of any search really needs to be understanding and going back to that grounding or North Star. What is our mission, vision and values? What is our purpose? What are we doing? What kind of leader do we need? What does the community need? What does the organization need at this point? And really factoring in, as you're building that job description, what are the short-term and long-term goals that the organization is trying to achieve based on what the board has really set out there as their strategy? Sometimes we need to obviously engage an executive firm to help us. Sometimes we're connected enough we can find us. But I think also really what is that compensation? I think that's the hardest thing for a not-for-profit organization or higher ed sometimes is who are our peers? Who should I be comparing to? And especially depending on the area that you're in and what that is. And then really being clear on who reports to this person and who then they report to. So that is a clear line of sight upon entry into this position. This, I'm going to say, in the supporting and kind of going back to Lou's slides, like how does the board create that relationship? Any executive needs to feel supported by their board. This is what our goal is. We're driving forward on this mission. There needs to be transparency and a comfort with the board chair and having that relationship when things come up. There should be regular performance reviews and really thoughtful and transparent reviews as a part of that that are really tied to what are the strategies of the organization and what are the goals that we did establish when creating this role that are revisited every single year. The board really needs to open up their relationships to this executive. It really needs to be who are the fundraising relationships we need to know? Who are the other sources, whether it's driving membership, whether it's driving, others in higher education, those sort of things. Like how do we get this community in front of this leader and really support them for success? I mean, big part of their job is helping fundraise and helping get the mission of the organization out there and that piece of it and feeling like they have a place to go and they feel supported and also have a mentor relationship with that board chair or whoever it is on the board that is assigned to this role. I think the biggest thing, and I just went through this with one of the presidents that I sit on the board for, is making sure they're taking time off. Don't get them burnt out. This has been a really hard time for a lot of our organizations who are just trying to stay in it and deal with COVID and deal with all of the restrictions specifically. So that piece of it is just making sure they're taking time to decompress and making sure they're having that thoughtful time to really be able to help establish some of that strategy and being thoughtful in what they want to do to drive the organization forward. Best practices is obviously the board chair should lead the review. This should be done on an annual basis. And all of the organizations I work with, that executive is doing their own evaluation, essentially, a self-evaluation that is tied to the goals that have been established with the board. That should be done. It should be done in writing, and that evaluation should be done at the board level. There should be a compensation study. You have to check that box on your 990. So let's make sure that we're doing it every couple of years and make sure you have the right peers. I went through this with a couple of our organizations that we just weren't hitting the right peers and getting the right compensation. So being very thoughtful in that and making sure that what you're sharing to the stakeholders, the users of your 990, is fair, complete, and accurate. So really thinking through that piece of it. So I think at the end of the day, the best, relationships I've seen are those that feel like support and really driving the organization going forward, and having that structure in place is key. With that, I am going to go to the next polling question. When was your last board retreat? Was it last year? Was it 2 years ago, pre-pandemic, or we've never had one?
I'm going to use this time to let everyone know we've had quite a few questions on if the slides are available and if you can share the recording. So you can download the slides now from the folder that says slide deck and handouts in your console. And then we're also sending them via email tomorrow along with a recording of today's webcast.
Yeah, and I will just add, there's a lot of very detailed questions we're getting, which is fantastic. We're likely not going to have time to go through all of those, but we are accumulating those and we'll get back to you if we can't address them today. We know this is a really important topic.
All right, here are the results.
Perfect. So a little bit all over the place, but interesting. I think that When I think about retreat, and maybe it's the way we word that, it could be a retreat, it could be a planning meeting, it could be a strategy meeting. I think whatever it is, and just resetting who you are as an organization where you're not just in the inertia of day to day is something to really think about. And I think when our not-for-profit organizations, who they are and the sustainability of them is so different than who they were pre-pandemic. So I urge you, if you're in management, to really push your board towards considering that. If you're on the board, really push your members to consider that. And if you're a financial steward or in some sort of relationship with a not-for-profit or a higher education institution, to really, remind them that is part of really having that healthy strategy that is current and really forward-looking. With that, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on, effective committees of the board. And there's a lot of information in the primary responsibilities, and I'm not going to spend too much time. I'm going to highlight a couple of these. I feel like a bit is redundant, but I'm going to start with your finance committee. Most boards obviously have a finance committee. Every not-for-profit or higher ed has finances. It is critical. I think the two most important things that I can tell you when you're thinking about an effective committee are the items that are the bookends here, the framework and the evaluate. I will tell you, and all three of these committees, I have sat on them, and as a CPA, and Colleen can attest to this, we usually somehow end up being the chair at some point. And so when I do take over those roles, it's the first thing I ask: what are our goals? What is the charter? Where are the established policies that we have? And I will tell you, 9 times out of 10, there's something missing, or there is no policy, or there is no charter. And so I think it's something to really ask yourself, or if you're in a management role and you're supporting a committee, to make sure they know that is part of a best practice. It's not obviously a requirement, but I would say it's a best practice. What are we here to do? Why are we meeting? And what are we doing it for? What are our ultimate long-term goals to serve the organization? And what is our short-term goals for this year? As a committee, I want to set up what am I doing this year? And what are we trying to accomplish? So I know how to evaluate the effectiveness of this committee. So I think it's really important. I think having term limits in committees is critical. And I think having a cross-sectional representation, depending on what the type of committee is really important. I've been on investment committees where it's all investment folks, and there's not much of a cross-sectionality to that. And so really being thoughtful of who would be stakeholders that are interested in this component of a not-for-profit organization? Who are the voices we want in a room, and who are the representation, diverse, what is their function, that need to be sitting at this table to help drive this organization forward? And what is our cadence? And be flexible with that cadence. So many times I come into committees or boards and they're doing 2 meetings and that's all they're doing, and this is what we've always done. And I think thinking about your primary responsibilities, which I'm not going to go through each and every one of those, it's a lot of information. How do you accomplish that with 1 meeting or 2 meetings? And do you have room for the other, right? Those things that are very forward looking. And so just really keeping that in mind as it relates to the committee and associated with that. So the middle section really is just a reminder of those things that we expect of a finance committee and their ultimate fiduciary responsibility as it relates to it. I have a little bubble. Sometimes I see finance committees or investment committees be a subset of the finance committee, depending on if there are even investments. We have some not-for-profit organizations that don't have investments, especially some government agencies, right, that are associated with some not-for-profits just do not have that. But these are things to really keep in mind. And I think what is critically important as a committee and the responsibility as a committee is everybody leaning in? Are they performing and contributing the way we would expect them to? Are they participating? Are they showing up to meetings? In those meetings, are they speaking? And more importantly, are we asking them to speak? And are they having roles and responsibilities? Did we accomplish the long-term and short-term goals? And where could we do better? And I think the biggest thing that I see, and it's the last thing on the right-hand side for evaluate that I see missing, is developing your succession plan. What is your pipeline? So many times I will be on committees and there's missing people, or only 2 people this year, or only 1 person because 3 people left. And really being purposeful in your succession plan and who you're bringing in are key. On the investment committee, very similar. When I think about best practices, you need to be doing the same framework and establishing that and the same evaluation. There's a couple things on the primary responsibility that I would like to highlight. You do and should have an investment policy, and it needs to be updated with what's going on, obviously, with financial instruments or non-financial instruments like crypto that are out there. You need to be evaluating your investment policy. This is your strategy that you're dictating to a CIO, whether internal, external, and those advisors that are working with you to be stewards of your money, the organization's money, and ultimately, your donors' monies or the greater goods money. And so you really have to be careful and review it on a regular basis, and to really, save the reputation of the organization. The one thing that I do see get missed, and this is an internal control thing that I'm just going to highlight as an audit partner, is reviewing the transactions. It is one of the controls that most organizations point to. Hey, my investment committee reviews our investment transactions and they approve or decline them. And it's key that it is noted that you are doing it and that you are approving or disapproving of some of those transactions. So just a couple things to highlight there. And I'll close with the committee that is near and dear to my heart, which is the audit committee. Again, I will just say that the bookends are incredibly important. Those goals can be different. There are great charter examples out there and some goals that are out there. I think based on some of the questions that we've gotten, we'll circulate some resources for folks who are looking for where is this policy? Where can I find an example charter? Those sort of things out there. But basically, audit committee is evaluating your auditors. Are they doing a good job? Are they getting stale? Do we need to do something different? What are the results of the audit? And then not always, but most of the time, our audit committees take in risk. What is the risk to the organization? How are we evaluating that risk? How are we remediating that risk? And generally reviewing the 990. Those are the key responsibilities there, more or less in that piece of it. And I think on this one, this is something where you are required by most states and their charitable laws to have a financial expert. It could be a CPA or otherwise, but it is key that you do have on this and your finance committee, and I would even say your investment, people that are functionally tied to this role, in addition to representative stakeholders from the organization and outside. So just things to really look for as it relates to thinking about the best practices. But I can't emphasize enough that an effective committee needs to have framework, needs to have goals, and you need to evaluate that and create that pipeline. With that, I'm going to give it back to Colleen to go through some of the trends as we look forward.
All right. Thank you, Melissa. And Melissa is totally right. Because of our day jobs, you're always asked to be on finance committees, and we always end up somehow being the treasurer. If you do have a CPA on your board, you might want to ask them, are you interested in programs or development before dropping them right into that treasurer role? Because it makes us feel really good to be asked to do something a little bit different. And it's good to have cross-functional education, too. So let's talk a little bit about what's trending in governance, because there have been a lot of changes in terms of how we just envision what not-for-profit leadership looks like, particularly learning some lessons from the pandemic. The number one thing that my clients are doing, and actually the board that I'm currently the chair of has done, is really evaluate our decision-making model. So the board that I am on, we ditched Robert's Rules of Order a couple of years ago. We realized that that process really wasn't serving us, and that our decision-making model, we wanted to be grounded in a lot more discussion and upfront collaboration versus bringing motions to the table. For most organizations, if you're not a government entity, you do not need to have parliamentary procedures when you are making decisions. And to really think about it in terms of outcomes, connecting back to what your goals and mission are can very much transform board meetings and how comfortable people feel participating and collaborating, particularly when they're newer board members. We've also been seeing larger boards get smaller. We've been seeing folks really want to right-size board size, in part because it has been challenging to get folks together, either virtually or in person, in the last 3 years. But it also has been really thinking about how do we actually represent the community that we serve, and who do we actually need in terms of the skill set. And it's not necessary to have people that are just major donors on the board, or people with just one key connection on the board. There are other and better ways to engage folks, as opposed to people that you really want in leadership. We really want the governance committee to look at that skill mix, to look at a skill matrix. And when we think about representation and diversity on a board, we absolutely do not want to just think about what folks' demographic characteristics are, but we want to think about what is the area of the community we serve, geographic representation, thinking about those key skills like finance, legal, HR, folks who have development expertise, people who understand governance, people who are very connected to programs and missions. You might bring on community members or individuals who are actually directly served in that role so that we can have that ideal skill mix and really bring that diversity of thought and expertise to the board. We also, again, we want that committee to lead those regular board self-evaluations and to keep educating the board. Don't assume that members know what you want them to. I think especially financial education. We had a question a little bit ago about how it's really hard to recruit treasurers, how it's hard to get folks with financial expertise on the board. If we really want to have a diverse board, if we really want to have folks who are truly representative of who we serve, we might need to invest in more education because we're likely looking for folks who might not have board service. And so thinking about that continuing education as just part of your work, so educating folks on governance, educating folks on what we do, and those key areas of responsibility, that can be something that the governance committee really digs into. And then we want folks to look at board member engagement. Are people not attending? Are they not responsive? Are they maybe over-engaged, too in the weeds? And really connect with staff on this, because staff often engage much more with board members than even the chair of a board will, because we have folks that we connect with for volunteering, for expertise, for lots of reasons. And so we really want to make sure that we're connecting with staff on who is engaged and who might need some help in terms of becoming a better board member. This is also an opportunity to assess term limits. We've had several questions about this as well. I would say more and more boards are moving to term limits. There is the con of you might lose a really great board member. When you establish term limits, you can always have folks take a break and then come back. But what we don't want to do is burn people out. And we also want a graceful way to off-board folks if we need to. So I touched on a couple of these things already. You know, the pandemic really caused a lot of turnover in both day jobs and on boards. People very much reassessed what their ability to serve was in all aspects of their lives. And at the same time, many nonprofits are looking at who is on their board, whether, again, they reflect our communities, but they also are what we need. If you have term limits, develop that timeline of when folks are serving, when they roll off, if they've been in leadership roles, and align that with your skill matrix so you know exactly what you're looking for. You also need to set expectations up front and be very clear with board members about what we expect from folks, particularly about fundraising. It can sometimes be an awkward topic. Then we onboard people who are not very comfortable with raising money for the organization, even though they're a board member. You can ask questions, ask for references, and as Melissa mentioned, use those committees to really develop your board pipeline. You can educate folks, you can get folks engaged in your mission, and then create a really strong pipeline to future leadership. When we are thinking about board diversity, we want to be very intentional. If we feel like our board does not represent us the way that we would like, then we have to think outside of how we have been recruiting and do not approach representation with a checkbox mentality. Your board is not going to benefit from that, but people who are not your dominant board culture are absolutely going to feel that. They will not feel engaged, and it's not the way to increase diversity. We also want to think about really digging into developing those skills. So if you have folks who have less experience, it's important to invest in them. It's also important to level set with your board. What are our expectations? What do we want to make sure that we know at all times? This absolutely is both staff and governance committee work, and I would say even executive committee work too. In the onboarding process, there are a lot of things that we cover. I would say the best boards do onboarding right at the beginning and then really continually throughout probably the first 2 years. And then when we think about that kind of ongoing education, we want to think about things like risk management, like good governance and DEI. So again, we have that level set. I also just want to cover for 1 minute ESG because I think it's a significant trending topics for most nonprofits that we work with, and it absolutely the questions are board driven. So when we have board members asking those questions, it's often because they're working in the corporate world, and so they're hearing a lot about ESG and wondering how we can respond. There was a question earlier about how do we balance sort of policies and what the board wants to do and folks' good ideas with the fact that we already have a lot on our plates as management. And ESG is one of those areas where I think staff feel like, oh no, something else that I have to do. So my recommendation for staff is to really be able to talk about what are we already doing under that ESG umbrella, and then engage in a conversation about what is the nice to have, or what is this a need to have for us at this point. Some funders are asking for information on our climate impact, on our social impact, and so it's important to engage folks in that conversation. So we've got one more poll. It is about ESG. Do you have a strategy, program, or initiative in place?
While we're asking that question, there was one question that came in that I'll try to answer, and it was related to the overlap in the Finance Committee. And you were right, there are certain states that have required or have laws established for no overlap. So for example, in the state of California, you can't have more than 50-50, right? So if you're on the audit committee and the finance committee, there's a limited number of overlap and what your chair can and can't participate in. So I would just encourage you to really make sure you're revisiting those charitable laws in your respective state, because there are rules around the component or the composition of your organization in their committee.
All right, thank you for the results, Amy. So I'd say most people are a no, but I see that 30% of folks thinking about it, and that feels about right. People are thinking about implementing something for ESG and trying to figure out where to go. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and I'll just wrap us up thinking about what makes an effective meeting. You absolutely want to avoid a report out style linked to your strategic plan. Remind folks of why we're here. Establish those meeting agreements to reinforce your cultural norms, and really spend time building relationships in your meetings. So don't jump right into business. Make sure that you've got some breaks built in for folks to connect. We absolutely want to be on a board because we want to make those connections and feel valued by the organization and other individuals on the board. And so relationship building is very important. And also pay attention to your hybrid needs. So some boards are now all virtual, some are back in person, but most are a mix. And so it's very important to consider that. I've got a slide on that coming up. And in the middle of a meeting, just ask for feedback. How is it going? What do we need? Here are some sample meeting agreements that we have. There are lots of sources for other meeting agreements, and it's great to have a governance committee engaged in this, or once a year note with the board, what are the things that we want to do to just note how are we going to enforce our norms throughout the meeting. So things like staying in topic, considerate participation. So if you're a person who talks a lot, wait a beat before you jump in. If you're quieter, make sure to speak up. I think it's also important to have us agree to respect and support the decision of the majority. So even though we strive for consensus decision making, there may be places where folks abstain or dissent from a final decision, but at the end of the day, we're all leaders of this organization. And so once a vote has been made, then we want to move forward positively and support that implementation. And anytime you have meeting agreements, stop and ask, what else is going to work for this group today? And then I'm going to end here just thinking about hybrid meetings. So I had to call into my board meeting last week because there was COVID in my house. I don't want to get anybody else sick. So I just experienced that. And I think it's worth us all just remembering that hybrid meetings can be more challenging than a virtual meeting. So when you're setting up a hybrid meeting, remember to think about it from that remote person's perspective. What can I hear and see? For folks in the room, really try to limit side talk to the breaks because it can make sound really challenging. For hybrid participants, use breakout rooms so that they have time to connect with each other, and also there's a little bit more privacy in their discussions. Consider using a facilitator and make sure that you call on folks who are participating virtually. Remember that they exist. Remember that they are playing a role and did show up. And then really try to use technology to equalize folks. So things like polls, using digital whiteboards, or a chat room for everyone can make a huge difference. And we are basically out of time. We will answer your questions individually. We'll follow up with everyone. I'm going to hand it back to Amy to wrap us up.
All right, thank you, Colleen and Melissa, for a really great presentation today. And I also want to thank our audience for being engaged and submitting all of your questions to help guide today's conversation. As the presenter said, if we didn't have time to answer yours, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. And then also feel free to reach out to Colleen and Melissa if you have additional questions. Their contact information is in your console. And if you met all CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed within 2 weeks should you have difficulty downloading it now. And as a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in your console. And finally, here's a link to an online survey for today's presentation. And thank you for joining our webcast. We hope you'll join us again next time. Take care, everyone.